Today's conversation is on career conversations in an age of COVID, and I'm here with some fantastic colleagues to discuss some career and professional development questions that students and postdocs have raised with us. And in fact, we're talking about our most important conversation, or one of the most frequent conversations that we've been asked about, which is navigating productivity expectations in a time of COVID, including defining your own expectations realistically and working with your PI to basically manage what those expectations should be, all leading into the second part, which is what do you need to do to keep your career on track? Like all of these conversations, we're covering two things. One, we're covering what we're sort of hearing about this issue and how people are feeling about it. And then two, we're covering a little bit more about what we've been recommending that students and postdocs do in counseling appointments. Okay, so let's get started. So one of the biggest issues that, as I said, that we are talking about is what students and postdocs should be thinking of and how they should be kind of conceptualizing productivity. We're going to begin by talking first to Gabby Monsalve, our Assistant Dean of Postdoctoral Scholars, about what you've been hearing from postdocs just in terms of kind of thinking about productivity, both either in terms of putting pressure on themselves or feeling that pressure has been put on them.
Thanks, Naledi. I've been hearing a bunch of things from postdocs, and along those lines of whether it's self-imposed or imposed on their supervisor, I can tell you that it is all tied to what postdocs aim to achieve here at UCSF to launch them into their next career step, whatever that step might be. There is a high expectation when you get here at an institution like UCSF to use this time, this very critical time, to launch your career. And during this time of pandemic, people are losing that time that they had scheduled in to do whatever it is that they came here to do, whether it was to publish a Nature paper, or whether it was to build an extensive network to launch them into, a private consulting firm or what have you. And so given the fact that postdocs usually are here about 2.5 years, this period of uncertainty has really heightened that level of anxiety among our postdoc population.
And so with that, let's turn to Associate Dean of Graduate Programs, Liz Silva, to sort of hear what she's hearing what she's hearing on the student front.
Yeah, it's very similar to what Gabby described among our postdocs. Our students have a much longer trajectory, a lot of our graduate students. And so a lot of them are still 2, 3, or 4 years away from graduating. But what they're feeling is a sense of anxiety that they're not able to make progress, that they're not meeting expectations for what they should be achieving. And that's both internally and potentially reading it externally from PIs. And I think that there's probably a couple of different groups. There's a group of students who are working on computational projects where they potentially have plenty to do, but it's difficult to focus. And so making an adjustment to understanding what you can and can't achieve, even though you have everything technically speaking that you need in order to move forward. And then there's also a group that are feeling stymied because they can't be in the lab. They're wet lab based. And so they're trying to find a way to still contribute, still be productive, still make progress towards their degree, towards their academic objectives, and eventually the career that they want to move into. But it's all thrown for a loop. And so trying to identify skill sets that they can accrue or courses that they can take that are a productive way of spending time. And of course, again, on top of trying to figure out, well, what's a reasonable timeline for actually learning these skills.
Right. And one of the things that you and I were talking about last week was just sort of like how there's just going to be this need to redefine productivity about like what is reasonable to achieve in 4 hours. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's helpful. I found it helpful to remember that everything is taking more time and more energy, whether it's going to the supermarket, thinking through your meals, making sure that your kids don't have their 5th meltdown of the day. Everything is just tapping more energy from you, and everything that used to take 2 hours to do potentially is going to take 4 hours to do. If I even just think about my own trips to the supermarket, where I am a healthy, able-bodied person, I have to quell a small amount of anxiety before I walk out the door. We have to figure out what's in stock and what's not in stock. And we may have gone in with our plans for dinner, which we now have to prepare every meal for every day, and then adjusting on the fly, all in a situation where our heart rates are probably running a little bit higher than they used to. And so, yeah, everything is taking more energy. So it's not surprising that it's not only distracting, but even in times of non-distraction, if you can find a way to focus, it's still going to take more out of you in the long run.
Right. And I think actually it might have been the OCPD team that was just talking a little bit about not just about sort of how much more time it was taking, but also just sort of feeling okay with the fact that you aren't productive. So Lawrence Clement, who is our program director on academic careers, can you just talk a little bit about sort of what you've been hearing about sort of people sort of feeling that they just need to be productive?
Yeah, so one of the things that's been interesting is the fact that our definition of productivity is very individual and personal and depends on the type of work we do. And so I think that what we're seeing is that if you had a bench type of job as a researcher, if you're working at the bench, oftentimes you would go in, do your experiments, and kind of monitor your productivity in terms of how many experiments you were able to do, or how far along you got into setting up an experiment that would take several days, how much data you had collected that day, and kind of this pace that you had, kind of this rhythm that you had has been taken away from you, and it's been replaced by something that is now online, and it can be making figures for a paper, it can be writing a grant, it can be learning new skills and analyzing data, but it's a different pace and a different rhythm, and it takes a moment for people to start adjusting to how to kind of feel like they've made progress in their day. So even if they're able to be productive, they might not feel productive because their milestones and their measurements for success have changed. That is one of the things that I've been seeing. And another thing I've been seeing is that for some people, they have all the data they need to work on. They usually work online. They have data sets that they're supposed to analyze, but the lack of structure in their day, the lack of interaction with people, and even in some cases, the complete absence of their mentors because their mentors have been pulled to COVID-related projects. So the mentors have disappeared for a while, and for a good reason, is making it that they're feeling very isolated, and therefore, again, are having a hard time keeping their usual rhythm, even though they're doing the same thing.
Right. And actually, Gabby, you were talking a little bit about all of us being careful about sort of setting an expectation that in fact people should be more productive, right? Or sort of, we were joking before about the fact that if you don't have, say, an hour and a half commute to work, then yeah, you've saved 3 hours in a day. So, so can't you do more? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, Naledi. So one of the things that happened really at the beginning, probably even before the shelter in place happened, but certainly within the first week or so, is that postdocs and students were hearing a lot of narratives either from PIs or from career professionals like on this call, offering suggestions on ways that they could maintain productivity while they sheltered in place safely. Things like maybe taking a Python course or brushing up on some coding skills. Maybe expanding your professional network. So using this opportunity to reach out to people and to build that network that was going to be really critical for you to move into the next step of your career. But as we're going through this, what we're realizing and what we've known is that if your basic needs aren't met, if you're living with a heightened level of anxiety that Liz mentioned before, and that Lawrence mentioned before, it may be really impossible to do these tasks that we know can be helpful in shaping and kind of keeping us on track for our career progression. And that's normal because, really we need to be focusing also mostly on our basic needs first before we start thinking about how we define productivity during this uncertain time.
Right. And Bill Lindstadt, who is our Assistant Vice Chancellor, and a career counselor. I remember in 2008, when sort of the last time that there was sort of a shock to the market, there was a conversation around students and postdocs about sort of saying things like, so if there's a gap in my CV, or if there's a gap with productivity, like how am I going to talk about that, like in an interview? Can you talk a little bit about sort of what we think we might be seeing when our students and postdocs who, for example, weren't able to get that additional internship, weren't able to do that additional work to kind of show productivity, because they were just focusing on keeping everyone alive and keeping themselves healthy, right, and getting minimal work done. Like, how do you think that career counselors will be recommending people sort of talk about that work, or will they even have to talk about it all? Will it be enough to just sort of say it was COVID?
Yeah, thanks, Nalidi. I think your last point was exactly what we're going to see. What we saw before was that there was wide recognition in the job market that that was an unusual time back in 2008, 2009, and people were taking longer to finish. There were cutbacks at some institutions in terms of the amount of time people could spend in their research or in their programs. People stayed longer because they're in their programs because there weren't job opportunities later, and it seemed like the job market was forgiving for that. And so I think this gets back to the point also of just sort of normalizing what's happening across the country, around the world, and everybody's facing the same issue. And so it's not like I've had a couple of appointments with trainees who are worried about their competition on the job market when it comes out. And I think all of your competition is going to be facing the same sort of detriment with their timing. And so I think that's a problem that people should just stop worrying about too much, because the rest of the competition will have the same issues.
Got it. And Mike Matrone, who is our program director and our associate director of OCPD, can you talk, as a person who kind of does a large number of counseling appointments for our students who are actually, and postdocs who are pursuing non-academic career paths, how, if a student came in and sort of said like, okay, so I didn't have a chance to do anything. It took me like 3 months. It took me 3 months, 6 months. It took me, in fact, I delayed everything for an entire year. Are they going to ask about that? What do you do in counseling appointments? Just for anybody who's never come to a counseling appointment, like, how do you sit with them? How do you strategize? How do you coach them? Like, what would that be like if I came to you and said, I'm concerned because it looks like it took me a really long time to graduate, and it took a long time because of COVID. What on earth? Like, how am I going to explain this in an interview?
Thanks, Nalidi. Yes, this is definitely something that will be discussed in the future when someone who's going on the job market needs to explain why weren't they as productive during these times. And I think really the best strategy that I could advise is to be honest about it and acknowledge the fact that during this time period, like all of us, we were sheltering in place. Our productivity was not as high as it could be, and just being honest about why there was a gap in employment, or why it took longer to graduate from your PhD work, or why your postdoc lasted a year longer than you thought it would. I mean, I always default to being honest, and when it comes to even applying for jobs, like, you can make that time known to a potential employer in a cover letter. They may see a gap of employment, or a gap, or maybe a long period of time on a resume, but in your cover letter is a time where you can explain those kind of special circumstances away. And it's usually like the last paragraph of a cover letter is a great place to say, I know that you see this. I acknowledge that it's there in my resume, and here's why it exists. And I think it's a key factor, or a key point to make in a cover letter for any situation where a gap or a longer period of time may have come up, whether it be for taking time off for parental leave, or being sick or having to take care of your parents. I mean, all of these things are valid reasons for a gap in service, or a gap in employment, or a very long period of time of employment. So that's generally my honesty is the general piece of advice there.
Got it. So I think the point that all of you are making is actually sort of reflected in the literature. That for those of us who sort of think about Maslow's needs, basic needs, there's just this theory that basically says that if the fundamental core things that you need to be okay, which include sort of psychological and physiological safety, your food, shelter, housing, food, shelter, and sort of safety is taken care of. If those things are not in place, it's going to be very hard, if not impossible, for you to do your best, most innovative work. There was another guy named Hertzberg who basically sort of looked at it within the work context. And basically, once again, if your job security wasn't together, right? Like if you weren't sure that you were safe at work, you were not doing your best work. And so I do think that there's this piece about sort of redefining this, or having the same goal, which is, how can I be as productive as possible? What's reasonable? But then also realizing that at every single time and at every single sort of era, and in this case, we're just sort of like in a COVID era, about redefining that and realizing that you're going to have to grapple with it yourself. Your PI is going to grapple with sort of what that level of productivity is going to be. And it's going to change pretty much week from week as things unfold, right? Does it take longer to go to get to the supermarket? Does it take does somebody in your family get sick? And that is going to have to be okay. And actually it is considered an intelligent way in which to actually sort of face a really dynamic landscape where it has no clear end date, which is to take it week by week and sort of think about how productive do you think you can reasonably be. And so it's not so much about sort of being gentle with yourself. It's really about sort of just thinking about that your role is to take care of yourself and to think about sort of from week to week, what does that mean about sort of taking care of yourself and your family and your well-being? And what does that mean about sort of taking care of your work? So that's that first piece about just thinking about like pressures that people have been perhaps sort of unreasonable expectations or pressures that people have on themselves. But there is a second kind of piece of information that we've been hearing about concerns that PIs have been actually putting more pressure on a student or postdoc than, or for a productivity expectation that a student or postdoc doesn't feel that they can achieve. So Gabby, could you talk a little bit about students and postdocs, like, and also Liz as well? When we first sort of went into sheltering in place, it seemed like students and postdocs were all trying to figure out and negotiate with their PI what the expectation was, and it sounds like some of that concern may have abated as this has progressed and people have sort of started to figure out what they need. But could you just sort of talk about sort of what might feel a little bit different about, say, like the first week or two versus what we're seeing now?
Sure, Naledi. So I think the first 2 weeks during this transition, people were just trying to survive, trying to ramp down their research activities, trying to set up what was going to become their work environment, trying to grab the groceries and the resources that they were going to need to shelter in place the most effectively. What we're seeing now, what I've called the second wave, is people now being in this environment, being at home, and realizing that maybe even all of the planning that they had done during this very quick transition may or may not be working for them, or even if it is working for them, it's at the beginning, it's not working for them now. The other thing that I'm hearing from postdocs is fatigue. Zoom fatigue is real. Fatigue with not being able to connect with their colleagues on campus, or only being able to connect with people in a setting, or only being able to connect with colleagues when talking about work, rather than being able to connect with people personally and to maintain that community that they had at UCSF. And so I think if the first wave was the rush and the anxiety of trying to transition quickly, now we're in the area of fatigue, of how long is this going to last, and can I do the things I thought I was going to be able to do in those first 2 weeks, when maybe I had a negotiation with my PI and I said these were the expectations for productivity that I set for myself and that we've agreed to. Can I keep that going? Is that sustainable for me? Is it what I want to do now?
Right. And Liz?
Yeah, I mean, I see similar things to what Gabby described, of course. I think I would characterize actually the initial phase a little bit differently, because I observed was constant rapid transition. Those first couple of weeks were, you had about 3 hours to enjoy the fact that you figured out that you had a plan, and then things changed and then you needed a whole new plan. We tried to, I think probably across the board, everybody tried to hope, we all hoped and we wished that perhaps we could retain some piece of normalcy, tried to hang on to a minimal disruption, or a disruption that could be managed, as it quickly became increasingly apparent that everything was going to be completely disrupted. And so with this new phase, I do think it's a little bit like what Gabby described, realizing that all of your plans had to go out the window, but at the same time realizing where where we are. We can't get any more isolated. We can't get much more affected than where we are at this moment in time. And there's probably both a grieving process and also an adaptation to a new reality. I think that too, we're now settled into the realization that this is going to be the new normal for the long term, and there's no minimizing the disruption anymore going forward. And so there's a combination of grieving for what you had hoped and the way you thought you could move through your degree, through your training, through your career, and simultaneously trying to figure out over the long term how you can reorient, redirect, and come out of it the best that you can.
Got it. And Gabby?
And I'll just add to Liz's point too, is there's definitely, especially among our postdocs, but certainly our students too, is who do you talk to about these issues? Are the things that I'm going through, are they normal? Is it just me? And not being on campus just exacerbates those feelings of isolation, and whether what this is that you're feeling is actually normal.
Right. And I think that actually brings up two interesting points before we move to this question about sort of, well, what have we been encouraging people to do, and how have we been encouraging them to kind of strategize as they look ahead. But there is this piece about, I think for myself, realizing that I had, say, like a first plan about sort of how productive I was going to be. And then experientially, I came to realize I needed to modify that plan, mainly because I have a kid who is not, who's just not okay with like just being in front of her, her remote schooling, and being in front of a screen by herself. And so I also think that one of the things for students and postdocs who feel frustrated that perhaps they feel that their PI has set the bar too high, or that they're expected that the PI didn't know, is that since there is no historical data point on what productivity levels a person can reasonably expect during a pandemic, and because everybody is figuring it out, it actually should be considered the norm that we all sort of got it wrong, right? That we all, and that your PI might not have enough information, or the landscape may have changed, right? And that their plan is changing. And so having those conversations about kind of revisiting this question about, well, what could I achieve? What can I achieve? What's reasonable to achieve is something that that the PI is going to take a first shot at guessing and working with you on as you negotiate it, and then you're going to have to revisit it, and then you're going to have to revisit it. And as Liz is saying, as this kind of this unfolds, that plan is just going to have to sort of continue to evolve. And living with that type of ambiguity, particularly if you are a planner, a person who loves to kind of like this is going to be like my plan 6 months out to kind of get X, Y, and Z, like that can feel very disorienting. And so there's this piece about also thinking about whether or not you might actually have a new sort of type of relationship with your PI. There was a really nice article in Inside Higher Ed of a faculty person who was basically sort of writing about how he was advising differently as a graduate advisor, and we'll make sure it's somewhere in the notes. And he was sort of saying that he realized that before he was focused on independence, and now he's kind of focused on structure. And he realized that his students and postdocs were saying, like, I really just want you to check in with me and sort of see how I'm doing, right? Like, and which isn't necessarily something like he would send off an email and check in with somebody, because he would expect to see them. And so just even realizing that PIs are also sort of like, their thinking is also evolving and they're trying to do it in real time. It's like learning how to fly a plane when the plane's already in the air and one of your engines is out, right? Like that everybody really is sort of trying to do the best that they can. And so we're sort of finding that when people are coming in to practice and to think about like, have this conversation and practice this conversation, that there's a sense that like the PI sort of is certain and this is the way it's going to be, when in reality, for everybody, we are all sort of evolving our thinking about how to navigate it. And so, Liz.
Yeah, I wanted to add a little bit and reiterate, echo basically what you're saying, because we've also heard this from our own faculty at UCSF. They are struggling too. And some of the things that they have on their minds is their own productivity, because they're trying to figure out what the impact's going to be on their funding. Are they going to be able to continue to employ the staff that they have? Are they going to be able to get that next grant? Of course, the NIH has been offering some very helpful guidance, and the POs have been very generous, and they've talked about extensions. But it's difficult to allay the long-term fears of a person who is very aware that they are financially responsible for a group of people at this time. And so, while what may come across as pressures on productivity may be rooted in anxiety about the economic stability of the people in their group.
Right, and just the unknown, right? And so the final thing that I'll say before we kind of move on to the next part is that we have talked to a number of students and postdocs who basically just kind of realized that they had some what we'll call unenforceable rules, which is sort of like when you wish a person would engage you in a particular way and you can't make them do it because you've got no power over them. But without realizing it, we all are figuring out sort of like what it is that we want from the people who are our supervisors in real time. And now we're figuring out like, how do we want people to behave in crisis? So we've talked with students and postdocs who've said things like, I really wish that my PI had asked me like what level of productivity that I could potentially achieve. And I think what we saw in one of our most recent pulses is that something like 70% of people said that the PI didn't ask that. But at the same time, 70% of them or 80% of them said that the PI did actually sort of like schedule a one-on-one meeting. Like they're not just talking in lab meetings, they're scheduling one-on-one meetings. So they're getting access, so the PIs are reaching out. And so there's this piece about just being aware of sort of like, and honoring sort of like, what did you wish your PI would say? Did you wish that they would say things like, we're closing the lab. Number one goal is making sure you're okay. So everybody's like, figure out that plan. Or did you wish your PI would basically say things like, I know that you are, that you have needs and goals, like you're not near your family, you need to actually kind of finish. And so I'm going to make sure that you're considered an essential worker, or I'm going to make sure that you get to work at home. The point is that there isn't one sort of way that people wish that anybody wishes that their supervisor or their PI would behave. And it isn't surprising that your supervisor, your PI might not have gotten it 100% right. There is a question about sort of how can you acknowledge what they did well? How can you acknowledge what you wish that maybe the support that you wish that they'd given you? And how can you actually get that support from other mentors, from other people on your committee, from other colleagues, from us, because there is this, because ultimately you still need the support. It just may be that your PI who's trying to figure out some things right now might not be able to step into that role. So let's actually kind of pivot to the second part, which is just thinking about like, what advice have we been recommending to students and postdocs, both in terms of kind of navigating their own sort of feelings and expectations around productivity, and what they have been, or kind of navigating the relationship with their PI. In particular, one of the things that is really interesting about a challenge in any sort of professional relationship or personal relationship is that crisis basically sort of highlights weaknesses in the relationship. It's like a UV light in a hotel room, right? Like it just lights up if there's something that needs to be, if you have concerns about the relationship. So if you were concerned about communicating with your PI before, you're going to still be concerned about it. If you were concerned that you and your PI weren't on the same page, you're still going to be concerned about it. And yet, there's been some lovely kind of articles about talking about it being an opportunity to think about, well, what do you want your relationship to be and how can you move towards that? And what kind of support do you want and how can you find that? So can we talk a little bit or sort of start to talk a little bit about, let's let's flip it and start a little bit about focusing on the productivity expectations of the PI. Bill, in particular, you had a couple of examples of counseling appointments of helping people kind of frame and navigate sort of what the productivity expectations were. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I've talked to a couple of trainees who were concerned. These are both people who were sort of late stage in their training, had an eye towards, going on the job market in the next year or so, and were concerned about the impact that not being able to get into the lab was going to have on their plans. And in both of those cases, it seemed like several points to cover that they may have found useful. And the first thing was that I was surprised that both people didn't recognize that everyone else around them is sort of having the same problem. And it seems obvious, but because you're not talking to all of your colleagues, you're not seeing people in the lunchroom on your floor and realizing that everybody is slowing down. It just seemed helpful to realize that we're all in the sort of same situation. So normalizing the fact that you are less productive and that you are slowing down seemed to be useful. The second thing that seemed useful was sort of being able to reframe, thinking of the situation, so reframing their situation, thinking of the whole situation differently, and realizing that if there's one way of looking at it is that I might be less able to go on the job market at the exact time that I thought I would be and look for faculty positions, next spring. Another way to look at it is, my PI is not telling me that my funding is going to end. I'm not sure about that, but I'm in a decently funded lab, so maybe that's something I should, clarify and make sure that that's, the positive side of it. A third thing that we talked about here also is focusing on what you can control. And if the word is that you cannot go into lab and do those experiments, that's not something you can control. But what are the things that you can control? What pieces can you work on? Would be another thing that sort of like these folks were sort of laying out in a plan and making a specific plan around. Another point was if there are things that you need to clarify, or in both of these cases, people were getting feedback from PIs that was maybe unclear about expectations. And so we made a plan for taking this on yourself and responding to your PIs with what you think you understood from that conversation about your productivity, and maybe reflecting back to them an email that has bullet pointed ideas of what the milestones and achievements you're going to have in the next the coming period. Making sure that you're on the same page with that PI. And then the last thing was just making sure you're taking care of your basic needs, meaning if you don't know when your funding is going to end now, it's time to clarify that now so that there aren't surprises later. And that's another reason to focus on your a very specific conversation with the person who's providing you with the funding. So it seems like I'm wondering if those points might be useful for a lot of people to think through, and they're welcome to make appointments with the staff here to sort of work through those in their own way.
Yeah, thank you. And actually, another point which goes to sort of making appointments is that there are a number of students who were on the academic market, and there are quite a number of institutions that have frozen their searches, but while others continue. And there are students who, for a number of reasons, are sort of thinking, maybe I should have a plan A and a plan A prime. And so Lawrence and Mike, I'm wondering if you can both sort of just talk a little bit about what you've been talking about with students who were kind of getting ready to kind of leave within the next year, and also sort of like how they could connect with you. So Mike, if a student came and was like, I was thinking of academe, but now I'm also thinking of industry, like what does a counseling appointment look like? Like, what do you talk about?
Yeah, absolutely. This actually just happened yesterday. I had a postdoc who was very serious about the faculty job market up until recently, and they looked at their prospects and looked at what was going on around the country as far as hiring freezes, rescinded offers, etc., and thought, they were not uninterested in industry, and kind of was ready to pivot and starting looking at industry positions. in their field of study related to, this person was a behavioral neuroscientist and was looking at different options both on the research side in industry, but also looking at like user experience research at places like Facebook. So it was a really great conversation, and then the way that that conversation unfolded was just like, here's how the non-faculty job market operates. Like, what does the application look like? What does the interviews look like? And so that was I was able to at least reassure this person that what they were doing to now was still valuable and still valid and still, you know, valued at these companies. And it's just about reframing how are you going to apply for these jobs and how are you going to market yourself for these jobs. It's just a different language that you have to use, really.
Got it. And Lawrence, in terms of individuals who might have been, say, 2 or 3 years out, to the people who are on the market now, what types of things have you been encouraging to think about and how to frame this? For example, I know that you were sending some people to look at ACRA to sort of work on that if they were able to, once again.
Right. The idea that people would have the time to do this. So there's always a conversation about whether or not there's an interest in a non-academic position, not because they won't be getting an academic position, but because there are a lot of unknowns now. And because this is a time where they could have more time to explore it, I encourage them to make an appointment with Mike if they have that interest. I would say that as you said, there are two situations. There are people who were about to go on the job market this year and are asking a lot of questions about whether or not there will be positions. And we really don't know, most likely less positions than usual because of all the hiring freezes we've been hearing about, but we really don't know what it's going to look like. And so a lot like what Bill was saying is there needs to be a conversation with the PI about what would happen if I needed to stay for another year. There needs to be a backup plan in terms of funding. So some people were saying, I was about to go on the job market, but I can also apply for a fellowship. So in that case, that might not be a bad idea to start applying for fellowships for continuing their position for a bit longer, especially if funding starts, drying out in the labs. In terms of preparing for the job market, because some people are still really interested in trying because we don't know what's going to happen. Usually I see a lot of people prepare their applications in September, October, November at the very last minute. And it's really interesting because the application process for a faculty position is gigantic. Like there's like a 20-page application, which requires building a research statement. And the research statement is not just a document you put together, it's really a thoughtful process and a program you've developed, and that hopefully you've been thinking about for the last few months or years, hopefully. And so this is a perfect time now, if you have the time to at least be thinking, even if you don't have time to be writing. There's a lot you can do while you watch children play in the sand, which they should not be playing in the sun right now, I think. But you can start thinking about what would be your research program in the future, so that when you're ready, so when you have the time to go back to your computer and start writing your research statement, it's in your head. You can watch some videos about teaching and understand what goes into teaching statements to create your teaching statement. So there are a lot of pieces to your application process that you could actually be starting now and could actually be stronger if you start it now. And we're going to be working on putting a lot of our content that we usually make available in the fall online earlier, but most of our programs have been recorded and can be watched now if people need it, and we'll link to that. But there's this idea that if things reopened, let's say this summer, and people went back in the lab, what I'm imagining is that people are going to rush to go finish experiments. And that will take away time from applying to positions, which takes a huge amount of time. So building that portfolio now might actually be a really smart thing to do if you can. That's the answer for the people who are going on the job market. So the second part is about the people who are a few years off, like you were asking, Nalidi. So for these people, for some people, there's the opportunity to stay a little bit longer in their postdoc. They were kind of thinking of going on the job market now, but they were kind of early and they have a little bit more time. And so again, this is where we go back to the academic career readiness assessment tool, which we'll link to, which helps you figure out what are the skills that you need to develop to actually prepare yourself for a faculty position. And yes, publications are very, very, very important. There's no question about that. But I would assume that there will be for those who have several years ahead, there will be the opportunity to catch up, because we know that postdocs and grad students work very long hours. So there will be an opportunity to catch up. And there's this kind of hidden curriculum in graduate and postdoctoral training that's not always talked about. It really depends on who's your PI and what your graduate program mentions in your training. But there is this hidden curriculum that, as I mentioned, that you need to have a research program that's your independent idea, that's your unique niche, and that is built over time, and it takes a really long time to build it. And some people start thinking about it at the end of graduate school, for example, and others start thinking about it in their postdoc. So if you have several years ahead of you, this is what you can start spending your time on, which is to start to understand what is going to be expected of you several years down the line. Start developing a very strong network, which you should be doing as well if you're about to apply for faculty positions. This is a great time to reach out to people for informational interviews, either for exploring a faculty position or for actually building your research statement and your research program. And this is, again, a time you usually do not have to spend even thinking about that. So again, these are things you can think about and create kind of those goals for yourself, which would reduce this sense that you're not progressing also. So if you can think about, I need to reach out to, let's say, 5 people in the next 5 weeks, or identify 5 people in the next week that I could connect with. That can build your network. And when you go back into the lab, you'll have a stronger network to rely on.
Liz.
I think that is excellent advice, and I would extend it to our graduate students as well. Our students who are multiple years out, I think that we're in the habit of thinking through your graduate career progression as a stepwise thing, where you have to complete the experiment, do the analysis of that experiment, design the next experiment. But I think it could be very helpful to take a really big step back. Something we're not really in the habit of doing because science can be so unpredictable. But think about what your longer term training objectives and even some of your career objectives might be. And it's an opportunity to maybe just reorder things a little bit. Do the things that you can do now, and acknowledge that there are things that you can't do until you get back into the lab. And it's actually an approach that's being considered across UCSF, all of UCSF's training programs, trying to think through what happens if our clinicians in training can't do their clinical training. Can we completely flip around the way that we do our education so that a medical student can still finish in 4 years by front loading the didactic that can be done remotely? And then when we can get back into being in person on campus, then we can work on the clinical aspect. So I think taking that really big step back and long view might be helpful too, so that you're not just creating busy work for yourself. You can be a little bit more confident that you're accruing a set of skills that at least you can see a place for them in your long term.
Got it. And that's a good point about sort of thinking about how it's a little bit different for people who are near the end versus earlier stage people, in terms of that their plan about keeping their career on track is a little bit different. And so I definitely want to just touch base with Mike, specifically talking a little bit about like our Mind and GeoScience program. So for those people who might be a little bit earlier, but then secondly, taking Bill's point about sort of thinking about like the funding and strategies. I was just wondering if either Bill and or Gabby can talk a little bit about our international postdocs, because they also might want to check in with ISSO and just wondering about extra aspects on that. But first, let me turn to Mike.
Thanks, Milady. Yeah, so our 2 programs, Mind and GeoScience, run by our fantastic program director, Linda Louie. GeoScience is graduate student internships for career exploration, and it is a program helping students be successful in exploring and securing internships during their course of study at UCSF. And then similarly, MIND, which stands for Motivating Informed Decisions, is another program that is designed to help students and postdocs kind of get started on career exploration. If you're not sure where you're headed in the next few years, then I would highly recommend enrolling in mind when it comes up this summer, to kind of create community around career exploration so they can join others in finding out where they want to go next.
Thank you. And Bill, I remember that yesterday, Holly was talking about, who's from our International Students and Scholars Office, was really talking about postdocs, international postdocs, just checking in with her. Can you talk a little bit about sort of what's going on from the international student, scholar, postdoc perspective, where postdocs perhaps also have an additional concern about sort of maintaining productivity and visa issues?
Yeah, so a couple things are happening there. One is issues around immigration and visa seem like they're changing so quickly that I wouldn't want to try to speculate on giving blanket advice here. But we do know that a number of our international scholars, if they're looking at longer times of training, are becoming increasingly concerned about the timing on their visas. And what our friends in ISSO tell us is that on certain types of visas, as long as you're making progress on your the reason that you were here to begin with, your visa should be able to be extended. But the strong encouragement is that you should check in with your ISSO team. If there's a particular person that you always work with, check with them, or you can also check with Holly Nagorizawa, as Nalidi said, in the ISSO, and she can direct you in the right way. But they're keeping on top of all of the changes. The ISSO team is nationally recognized for expertise in J visas and H visas, and it would behoove anyone who's concerned to check in sooner rather than later.
And so when we are, as we're kind of wrapping up and sort of just thinking about sort of these two kind of sort of waves, which is people who are earlier in the state, who are early in their career, who sort of have, they have like a longer runway. It sounds like we're saying that their plans about what they need to do to position themselves haven't changed. They're just going to continue to try to be as productive as possible and sort of ride out the wave. There is this issue about people who are closer to graduation, perhaps sort of thinking about having a plan A and a plan A prime, and also just sort of checking in about what they need to, if they're, for example, if they're an international postdoc, checking in with ISSO to just sort of just make sure, like, what information do they need to know as they sort of start to position themselves out, but also to make sure that they're secure as possible while they're here. And so as we sort of think about other advice for students and postdocs, I think there was a conversation before about students and postdocs maybe sort of thinking about, like, how do they structure their time at home, figuring out what that structure is. And so, Mike, I know you were talking a little bit about time management. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. I can. I'm not a big fan of the word time management because you can't manage an hour and end up with an hour and a half. So I like to say, like, how better to utilize the time that you have. And I think a lot of the anxiety that's coming out now is because of what Bill was referring to earlier, is that, like, there is just a lack of control right now around a lot of things. But one thing that you can control is how you spend your time. And there's a great book out there that I advise others to utilize. It's David Allen's Getting Things Done. And what I really like about this book is that its premise is, to be productive, you have to get out of your head all the things that you've committed yourself to, whether that be writing them down or using some sort of collection method to say, here's all the things that I've committed to, and here are all of them written out, so now I don't have to remember them. And then you can, the book kind of outlines from that step how to structure your approach to getting all those things done. So I'm not getting paid to say this, unfortunately, but it is probably my go-to book for time management, time utilization strategies.
And Bill, you had talked before. I just wanted to be sure to loop this in, just following up on other resources, including ISSO would be helpful for international students and scholars to check in with, to just sort of make sure that if you've got concerns, or if you understand, or that you sort of understand your visa and sort of what what the expectations are around it. But you also head the Learning Resource Center. Is there advice that you have, or sort of like when should students actually check in with the LRS team?
So I think Peggy Ryan in Learning Resource Services is a wonderful resource for students. And, while her primary remit is to work for graduate students and other students here, she's willing to talk with postdocs. And so reaching out to Peggy would be a great idea if you're just struggling with issues like how do I organize my time, or as Mike says, make the best use of the time that I have. She has some great skills and tips that she can provide, but it's not really something that can be done in a blanket format. And so I think an appointment with her would be probably the most useful thing if you're really struggling with this, how do I get things done issue, and you want to talk with someone about it.
And so then why don't we end by talking a little bit about sort of specifically managing the productivity expectations of your PI if you have concerns about it, because they're really sort of two sets of groups of students and postdocs. They're the students and postdocs who have concerns, who have not yet had a conversation with their PI about the issue. And the second is that they're individuals who've had a conversation with their PI and they sort of feel that it didn't go well. And so, Gabby, why don't we start with you? Can you talk a little bit about if a postdoc is in one of those two categories, either that they have concerns and they haven't yet had a conversation, or they have concerns, they had a conversation and they sort of feel it didn't go well, and they came to your office, sort of like, how would you frame it? Like, for the people who haven't yet had an appointment with you and might feel a little intimidated about having an appointment with an associate dean.
Yes, thanks, Naledi. So I unfortunately have these conversations with postdocs all of the time. And I'll just preface this by saying I was a postdoc at UCSF. And so I understand a lot of the cultural pressures that postdocs face at UCSF. So don't be intimidated by coming and reaching out to me. One of the things that I do with postdocs, and I have done with postdocs during this pandemic, is to first we do a needs assessment and an assessment on why the person is there, what they're seeking to get out of the conversation. And then we lay out I lay out a series of options of what we could do, who we could talk about. And then from there, it might be, if we've done an assessment and it comes out that you wish to have this conversation with your PI, but you don't know how to do it, then we can, we can do a coaching session with you for the next 30 minutes, and then we'll coach you on the things that you can say, that you can frame around your unique situation. And all of this is, of course, tailored to each individual postdoc. And so that you have the tools and you have the time to practice this before you actually get into the situation with your PI. If you've had this conversation and it's not gone well, I do a similar thing with postdocs. We sit them down, we do an assessment, and then based off of that, lay out some options, and then do, either another strategy building session where it could be a coaching session where we practice again, or it could be something where, maybe something like a mediation through ombuds is really what you're going to need, because this is beyond the scope of just a difficult conversation or negotiation you have with PI. There may be other things that are happening. And so those are the types of things that you can expect from me with different situations. There is a third situation where it goes beyond just having a difficult conversation or negotiation. And there are other things that I can do to help support postdocs at that.
Thank you. And Liz, can you talk about if a student has a concern but hasn't had the conversation, or if a student has a concern, has had the conversation, and they feel it didn't go well, and they come and they see you? Like, once again, it can be very concerning to go and talk to your associate dean. How would you, what happens?
Yeah, it's very similar to Gabby. Students can come and talk to me. I have no obligation to do or share any of that information with anybody, so long as we're not talking about a Title IX issue. What's said in the room can stay in the room, and we will together talk about the very particular situation that you're in, and we will brainstorm possible next steps and routes forward that we won't execute unless we both agree that that's the best way to move forward. In some cases, it has turned out that a student might just want somebody to hear them. In other cases, we've done a variety of things, including help prepare the student for a conversation with their PI, with or without the help of all of my wonderful colleagues across Student Academic Affairs and the Graduate Division and the Office of Diversity and Outreach, because they all have, we all know each other very well. We all know each other's really unique expertise. And those of us who are on this panel right now, we're really well equipped to make sure that we get you the best advice possible for the particular situation. I think the only thing that might be a little bit different for students, which could hopefully is comforting, is you've got a stronger faculty network available to you in the form of your committee. So that's something that we can talk about, whether it could be a faculty member who's on your committee or not on your committee. We also have a program director and a program administrator. And that network can be particularly valuable because it can be an additional faculty level sounding board that can help gauge appropriate responses and expectations. So it's not just you with your opinion and your PI with a different opinion. It's a little bit more of gauging of what a normal set of expectations might be for your particular situation.
So as a final point, I will sort of say that people can come to our office, the Office of Career and Professional Development, in particular, as you know, to talk about, to brainstorm ideas about career options, to talk a little bit more about keeping your career on track, and also to practice that. One of the challenging things is actually just saying the words again and again and again. Your opening, what you're going to say to your PI, how you're going to negotiate, your close. And so after you go and see Gabby or after you go and see Liz, it is totally reasonable for you to check in with one of us to basically schedule an appointment to just practice having the conversation again and again and again until you feel comfortable basically reaching out to your PI. And maybe you figure out things like, I'm going to send it first as an email and follow up in a conversation. I'm going to basically have it in my one-on-one. Like every aspect of what's essentially a negotiation is just something that it's really, that people usually feel more confident and prepared if they actually have a chance to kind of think it through and practice it, and also kind of start to brainstorm through a little bit about how they think that their PI will respond to it, and actually are self-aware and think a little bit more about what their concerns are about talking about this particular issue with your PI. But in the end, while it's counterintuitive, there are a number of situations where when you have a disagreement or conflict, you actually need to move closer, as in you need to have more conversations, when in fact you may actually feel very frustrated or concerned and want to actually sort of try to avoid them. Now, know that avoidance and sort of trying to go around someone is a valid strategy. We can talk about when that works, but for a number of you, actually sort of figuring out, like, how do I talk to my PI during COVID is a new kind of thing that you need to actually sort of think through and figure out. And we just want you to know that that UCSF has a whole kind of slew of resources available to help support you. It's just that, once again, the quirky thing of it is that in many cases you once again have to reach out to them because you're not on campus. And that final part about realizing that there was this lovely paper that came out before that sort of acknowledged the support that students and postdocs had in the lab, your fellow students and postdocs as mentors, as people who gave feedback, as people who helped teach you something. And that, once again, like, that's part of the structure that just got deconstructed. And so thinking a little bit more about how to reach out. And so, for example, one of our lovely staff people today just sent out a Zoom message that said, hey, at 10:45 to 11, I'm going to have a coffee break if anyone wants to join me. So you can be that person. You can be that person to start to sort of think about community, because connection is going to be key in helping you actually sort of figure out the best practices and the support to navigate this crisis. Even if you're no matter how your relationship with your PI is, but in this case, it's going to help you sort of figure out how to actually sort of think about how you can have the most productive relationship possible with your PI, considering the circumstances, right? And that's always the case, right? So what's the most productive way that you can have a relationship with your PI if you're in your first year? What's the most productive way you can have a relationship with your PI if you guys are disagreeing about something? What's the most productive relationship that you can have with your PI if you're during a crisis, right? Like that focus on that, managing that professional relationship, that doesn't go away simply because of COVID. In fact, it just sort of, in some cases, might feel as if it's a little more fraught, but know that UCSF has support to help you navigate it. And that's really the main thing that we want you to know, that there are resources here. And if you connect with any one of us, we'll get you to the right resource if we're not the right point person, to make sure that you sort of feel that you have the support to have the important professional conversations that you need to have. So with that, that is our conversation. We hope that you'll share this with students and postdocs who weren't able to, who might not know about this session, because you basically are sort of the conduit in your community. And also, we hope you'll actually tune in and pay attention to our next sort of missives out as we ask more questions and send more resources. So thank you so much, everybody, for being here, and we hope to talk to you soon.